Hello, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to our comprehensive 1-hour webinar on MMC. So what I'm going to do is just let a few people join, and as I'm doing that, I will talk to you. So today, what are we trying to do? Well, actually, no, before I'll start on something else. My colleague Ricky and I will be creating even more webinars upcoming. We're not going to be doing them weekly anymore, and probably not even bi-weekly, but Ricky and I like to foster relationships with housing development professionals. We're here to understand your needs and create good content for you. Whether you buy our software or consultancy services or not, all that really we're interested in is understanding development professionals and what they need. So what we're looking for is, what would you like us to cover in our webinars? What resources do you need to aid you in your task of solving the housing crisis? I'm going to post our links here. And if you want to take a quick 15-minute chat with us, or send us an email, we would greatly appreciate that. So this is my Calendly link here, and this is Ricky's. Excellent. Right, okay, so looks like our attendees are beginning to peak now. Today, what are we talking about? MMC. MMC has been one of those things that I just keep hearing about. The MMC war drums are always banging, and they are always talking about Savills reports, Homes England. Everyone needs to be 3D printing houses and recycled coffee grains with net energy zero compliance levels by 2050. But, you know, that's at its most extreme, we see those things. But the Homes England scheme quietly disappeared, from what I understand. No one can find anything about its progress, and it certainly stopped being mentioned. And thousands of MMC companies come and go like a cryptocurrency. To try and navigate this area, and people do, of course, we all appreciate that MMC is something that the industry certainly could have and could be useful if we could get it right, if we could get the scale, if we could get reliability. So what we're trying to do today is understand that question. How reliable is it? How do we navigate this maze? So we have Neil Toner from Devonshires, who will be talking legals, and he'll be opening with that. Then we have David Ellison from a reputable, established, longer-term MMC company, who will be discussing what their business view is and how they deliver. And then, of course, we have Joy Winnerah, who will be just sort of, I guess, challenging both of those presentations. And then we're going to open up to you in the panel. What would you like to talk about? Now, before we go to Neil Toner, I actually asked Jonathan Walters, who's the Deputy Chief Executive of the Regulator of Social Housing, because one of the things he said when he last was on our webinar, it was the last one, housing associations are more exposed to risk and do not have the credit ratings they used to because of their reliance on outright sale. I asked Jonathan, if an RP decided to move forward with a 100% true MMC scheme dependent on outright sales, would they receive a higher risk rating? In other words, will RPs participating in MMC have their credit ratings downgraded? Jonathan's answer, well, that would prompt a question from us about how the board will manage the risks associated, and any view we take will be based on the quality of the answer. So, having a true MMC scheme in a multi-tenure format, reliant on outright sale, will not actually necessarily give you a higher risk credit rating, well, a lower credit rating and a higher risk rating. So without much further ado, I am now going to go on to Neil Toner.
Cool.
Neil, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. As you'll guess from the slide, I'm going to be talking about 5 key points to include in a MMC or modular development agreement. So if I could have my next slide.
Okay.
So MMC is different, and that has to be acknowledged. Traditional forms of building contract have evolved over many decades and are very well suited to a traditional form of building. But in a very practical way, delivering a scheme through MMC or modular is a different way of building something. And that's not wrong, it's just different. But that does need to be recognised in the contract. Many of the same issues arise, so it's not like you tear up a building contract and start on a fresh piece of paper, but you just need to be alive that there are differences. And one of the issues about MMC is that it covers a host of different things. So there is no such thing as a standard MMC contract. There are contracts that are suitable for different types of MMC. So it is important that when you're looking at your contract documents, you have an understanding of how your MMC is being delivered, and to make sure that the practicalities of that fit in with the contract that you've got. Next slide. So as I say, so I'm going to be looking at kind of 5 critical points that come up. Again, I may sound negative, but I'm not. I'm a fan of MMC and modular. It is just that you need to go into it with open eyes. So the first point in an MMC or modular contract is intellectual property rights, by which I mean the right to copy, use and adapt the plans and drawings and designs that have been developed in relation to the project. On an ordinary development project, there isn't a huge amount of intellectual property in bricks. Generally speaking, the kind of ways that you construct something are fairly well known in the industry as a whole, and therefore people tend not to be overly precious about their intellectual property in what they're giving you. So your building contractor is not overly precious about it. That is very different in an MMC and modular form of contract. The constructor will have often spent millions of advanced funds in terms of developing the design of its product, and it does not want that to get into general knowledge or general use, because it then loses its intellectual property and its right to exploit it. So one of the tensions you will have in any MMC development agreement is around the intellectual property that is in relation to the module. The person who's buying the property, the owner of the site, can't live without any copyright. It's going to own that property for decades to come. It will need the ability to use and copy and develop plans if it wants to maintain its properties, if it wants to adapt them in the future. So there will be a tension between the employer and the constructor, and that will need to be discussed and resolved. Usually you kind of get to a moderately satisfactory place where the owner can use plans, etc., for maintenance, sometimes for adaptation, very rarely for extension or future building, and that is probably a reasonable compromise to reach. So again, it is just one of those issues that needs to be talked through and a compromise position reached. So that's point 1. Point 2 for my next slide. So inspection. So in a traditional building contract, you have a site. The possession of the site is given over to the contractor. The employer essentially is not allowed onto that site unless the contract allows them onto that site, and usually it will. Usually there will be provisions that say that the employer and their professionals can come onto the site to carry out inspections. There is quite often a debate about when they can come on, how much notice they have to give, how many people can come on, and important things about complying with health and safety and security arrangements. So that's relatively straightforward, and you will still need that in an MMC contract, because you will still have a site, you will still need the ability to check the works on the site. But in addition, you will have a factory somewhere, and an employer is going to want to be able to check and see the modules being prepared in the factory. So there will be an element of off-site inspection, and it's important that that is dealt with. Because the factory is usually dealing with the construction of products for lots of different clients, the constructor will usually be slightly more restrictive in terms of the number of times you can turn up and how much notice you need to give. And that's probably not unreasonable, but again, it needs to be checked through. And from employer's point of view, they need to work out physically where the factory is and whether in the contract there is a restriction about moving that factory. Unless there's a restriction, there is, in theory, no reason why the factory couldn't partway through the development be moved out of the country. Some of the international constructors have factories all over the world. You don't necessarily want your units to be constructed in Malaysia, not because you've got anything against Malaysia, it's just you won't be able to inspect them, or if you do, it will be a very expensive inspection job. So you need to make sure that you have the ability to inspect the factory, and you need to have an understanding of where the factory will be and whether that is controlled in the contract. Point number 3, so next slide, is the money. And I would say this is probably the trickiest area of MMC and modular contracts by far. In a traditional building contract, the employer usually owns the site. The contractor is building on that site, and as the contractor lays brick upon brick, the value of that site goes up. So the employer paying monthly or on stages is a perfectly logical thing, because they're actually getting the product as it's built. And if the contractor disappeared, they would be able to get someone else to finish it. And because it's traditional build, there would be usually a pool of people who would be able to finish it relatively straightforward. I mean, your contractor disappearing part of the way through your development is always going to be a disaster, but it's not the absolute end of the world on a traditional build. Different particularly on modular, where the bulk of the construction is going to happen off-site. So you, the employer, are not going to have your value of your land increased until the modules are actually delivered and placed on site. And that can be significantly partway through the development, because a large chunk of the development is happening at the factory. So the employer has an issue that it doesn't want to be paying out lots of money before it's actually had something on its site. The other issue is if the modular contractor goes bust partway through, you may find there's simply no one to finish the development, because they are the ones who build that type of module. And I have certainly known schemes where the developer disappeared, went bust partway through, and the only practical solution for the employer was to clear the site of everything and start again, which is obviously pretty disastrous. So, I mean, there are ways to deal with this. There are bonds, there are guarantees, there are escrow accounts, which kind of deal with holding the money partway through. In theory, employers could have the right to step in and manage the factory. In practice, that is almost never practical. So I would say this is trickiest. There's no right or wrong answer to how it's solved. And actually, to be fair, no comfortable way of being solved. And it's something that you need to go into contract with your eyes open. And it is also essential that you choose a modular contractor, or when you're choosing a modular contractor, you take into account their stability. And going for someone who's got a long history is a lot more sensible, because of the dangers of them disappearing, and that is obviously reduced if they've got a long history. That's point 3. Point 4, so next slide. So transportation is a big issue on, again, particularly modular, which doesn't necessarily come up in most other building contracts. The transport from the factory to the site is actually one of the most critical aspects of a modular construction. It's one of the most difficult, it's one of the riskiest. That's when the units are at their most exposed and liable to damage. So it is important that the contract makes sure that the constructor is the one liable. Constructor is the one who is responsible for making sure that there is actually a practical route for delivery, and they don't get, part way down the country and realise there's a bridge in the way. So it's important that they are made to take steps to make sure that they can deliver on time. I have known employers want to be notified so they can actually inspect the delivery process and the transport process, so they can check that the units aren't being knocked around. Again, it's just an extra twist to a modular or MMC contract that doesn't necessarily come up in a traditional building contract. And then my final of the 5 points is expecting the unexpected and effectively risk. So in traditional building cost contracts, you will have various provisions around insurance, insurance of the works as they're going up, insurance of the site, third-party liability insurances in case anyone's injured during the development, and or adjoining owners are damaged. All of those are also still relevant on an MMC contract because there's still a site, there's still a development project. But in addition, there are other elements and layers of insurance that you will need. So, for example, as I talked about the transport phase, that is a particular complex point. There will need to be specialised insurance to deal with the transport risks, particularly if you may even find that there are cross-border issues. If the modules are being constructed out of the country, you'll end up having to have international insurance provisions. You would expect to see insurance of the factory itself. That's something you don't see in a traditional building contract. And you will also need insurance of the modules as they're built, and even the materials that get incorporated into the modules. So significantly additional insurance provisions. Nothing to be scared about, but just something to work your way through. So those are my kind of 5 key points. In the legal sense, there are, in any modular contract, there will also be lots of learning curves on the practical side in terms of specifications, but I've concentrated on the legal side. And I would reiterate, I'm obviously a lawyer, which means that to me, points are always half empty. I look on the bad side, I look at the risks, but modular is a great way to build. I've got clients who have really successful modular developments. They are delivered in incredibly short periods of time, and they are incredibly happy with the end product. So I wouldn't let this scare you off. You just need to have open eyes when you go into it. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Neil. Fantastic presentation, well executed. So now I'm going to bring on David Ellison from Fusion Building Systems. Okay, and David, off you go.
Yeah, cheers, Chris. You may as well sort of move on to the next slide, if you will, which is a little bit about me. Basically, I've been in the industry for over 20 years, not only for off-site light gauge steel framing, but for off-site volumetric modular. So yeah, fairly experienced in the field. Do you want to go on to the next slide, please? So a little bit about Fusion. Been around since the year 2000, specialists in light gauge steel frame structures. They've gone through a little bit of a period of change. I think a lot of it was post Grenfell and the type of solution that we specialized in. So we've kind of moved on to something new, which is Fusion X. And I say new, I've been doing it for a few years now, but the difference being it's a non-combustible solution as opposed to what was a pre-insulated EPS panel, which works very well in low rise and is still okay in low rise. But as a company, the direction we're going is with Fusion X, a non-combustible system certified up to 10 stories. Next slide, please. Now, this is my second stint at Fusion, and people always ask, why Fusion? And to be honest with you, the way they do things, the way they actually engage early and form the relationships with the design team and have a collaborative approach throughout the whole of the process actually sets them apart. And I'll be sharing on LinkedIn shortly, I suppose, a testimonial we received, which was basically, it was almost a Carlsberg moment. And it was basically probably the best subcontractor we've ever worked with. And it was quite nice to read. And I wouldn't say it's unusual, but to have it to that level is good to read. And as I say, I do believe that we are well respected by the industry. We manufacture our light gauge steel frames out of the Northampton facility, so we're centrally located in the country, and we've got a very good track record. Next slide, please. Now, there are an awful lot of benefits of light gauge steel frame, and I'm not going to go through every single one of these. The thing with me is you'll get in a building, you compare it to other different types of construction, and what you get in is a very sustainable product. You can reduce the carbon footprint. I mean, we will do concrete floors, we will do steel cassette floors. So if you get a client that's really keen to reduce their carbon footprint, then we can offer a steel cassette as part of the build. And again, we'll do that up to 10 stories. However, we like to be flexible. So if a client comes back and says, well, we want the thermal mass in the building, we want the inherent fire protection and everything else that goes with that, then yes, we'll do a concrete floor. And again, the whole thing will be designed to support everything within that. So we'll do a full superstructure, including hot roll steel frame that's required for the design to support anything that's perhaps a longer span or a load bearing wall that doesn't line up. And the thing with light gauge steel framing is that with early engagement, getting that design right is key, because if you have all of the load bearing walls lining up and you've got repetition and traceability throughout the frame, you have less hot roll steel, less cost, and a more efficient design. Next frame, please. The sectors that work for off-site MMC and especially light gauge steel framing are the ones that are shown there. I would say the key ones, I suppose, for actual suitability of student accommodation and hotel, because you've got your short spans, you've got repetition, and you've got traceability through the frame. But one of the hottest sectors, I would say, at the moment is residential. So your residential apartment schemes, also houses. We will do houses, but residential apartment schemes do work very, very well in this particular sector. And I think the sector that's going to sort of emerge and come through a little bit stronger is the retirement living, extra care, later living type sector. We're seeing an awful lot of interest in this. One of the major players is already going down that route, and I think the others will follow. So I think there's a lot to be optimistic in light gauge steel frame and off-site MMC. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that I would say probably 5 years ago, I was hearing an awful lot about was actually, oh, it's change, it's different, it's something, and it's awareness that people didn't really have. That whole narrative has changed now. And I think the off-site MMC narrative is very positive. People are open to it. There is still resistance to change, and people want to do things traditionally. However, we're hearing terms like PMV, which is pre-manufactured value. Basically, what more can you do in the factory? So where you have your volumetric box, where I call that the Lego of the industry, and you've got light gauge steel frame, which I call the Meccano of the industry. You are taking a panel, you're putting it on site, you're erecting it, and you're putting the floors in, and you're building in levels. If you're adding more pre-manufactured value, it's basically what more can you do to that frame? Can you put windows in? Can you put dry lining in? Can you do that? There's so many things where you can actually get into a final panel, but there are issues with that. Basically, the fixing on site and the transportation, because the more you put onto that panel, the more risk you have with transporting it, which Neil has sort of touched upon is a big thing, and actually erecting it and fixing it down and fixing it panel to panel. So it's a new narrative. It's something that we're aware of, and it's something that we're looking at, and I think the whole industry is at the moment. But the whole concept of light gauge steel frame is that you do more off-site. It's in a controlled factory environment. You've got less risk, and when you're on site, you're actually erecting the frame with a team of 4 people, perhaps 5 people, perhaps 6 people. But generally speaking, you can do a team of 4 with one crane hook lifting the panels in. So you've got less people on site, less health and safety risks, and a faster build. And it is. The thing where clients really do need to engage, though, is the follow-on trades, because as you're building, you can build one level, get a safe level in between, and then you're on to the next level. And at this point, you can then chase up the building. So if you've, let's say you've got a 10-story building, when you're on level 3, level 1 is being fitted out with first fix M&E and you know, the dry lining. It's getting it watertight enough so that they can actually do those follow-on trades and actually chasing up the building. The biggest thing is the driving rain through the windows. If you get those windows in early, and you're then managing any ingress of rain through the stairwells and the lift shaft, you can really accelerate that build program. Next frame, please. I touched upon the fact that, you know, this is a very sustainable product. You know, it's probably one of the most sustainable materials in the build process. And, you know, we're very, very aware of that. And I think there's a big drive, and people are talking about, you know, net zero and all the rest of it. And I think as a company, we're looking at ways that we can, you know, sort of do that in-house and with what we're doing. And I think we all need to be aware of this. However, like I say to other clients, you know, you really do want to reduce your carbon footprint and you want to eliminate, say, concrete from the build, we can do that. And offering steel cassette floors is a very good way of doing it. Next slide, please. So yes, in summary, design it right and with off-site MMC in mind. I find so many projects that come to us in the first instance have been designed with another method of construction in mind, or even almost a broad brush. It could be this, it could be that, it could be the other. If you actually decide that you're going to build your scheme in light gauge steel frame, then it doesn't become just a VE exercise. And the fact that you then have to look at the architectural drawings and tailor them to the actual frame that's going to be chosen. If you engage early and you partner, then you are going to get a lot of benefits by doing it. And I think if you kind of do that as a client, and if you make that, you draw that line in the sand which says, yes, we want to go down the offsite MMC route, light gauge steel frame suits this construction, and that's the way we're going to design it to start with, then great. I think everything's going to work fine. And next slide, and I think that's me done actually. So I shall pass back to you, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you, David. David and Neil's presentations are going to be available. After this, everyone will be sent it in the recording. So what I would really like to do now is, so now it is time for Joy Winnerah to have the floor. Joy, you've got the floor for the following 10 minutes, and we'd love to understand not just your opinions of obviously the presentations that you've seen, but also your real life experiences in this area.
Thanks very much, Chris. Yeah, so no snazzy slides from me, just my face, I'm afraid. So yeah, really great stuff from Neil and David there. And I have to say my experience of light gauge steel frame was excellent, you know, on the site that I worked on, in terms of kind of comparing that to some other MMC methods as well. It was really fantastic. I think the thing that's come out in both of those presentations is that absolute clarity that there is not one size fits all, and everything is very, when you're talking about MMC, it all gets lumped into this big box, and it is so different. It is, you know, even if you take something like modular, depending on which modular company you are working with, the services that they will offer you are wildly varying, and you have to do your research. So again, I'm not sitting here as a naysayer. What I'm saying is, please go into this with your eyes open. And if you were comparing a number of different modular providers, you have to really get into that detail really early, as David said. So it's about, you know, knowing your site and going with that really open mind and not having anything too set, because certainly what I've found is, if you go in there with a set opinion on what you want it to look like, etc., you're immediately narrowing your options, and actually that one company that you end up with, because they can meet your specification requirements, might not meet a whole load of other requirements that you didn't think about at the time. There's a big question for me around the groundworks, responsibilities for groundworks, how that comes across in the contracts, how your warranties work with that. I think the timings point was really well made by David about follow-on services and services themselves as well. I think the one thing with MMC that I've really picked up through experience is, in development, timings change. We know that. That's just the way it happens. Things get delayed. You know, services don't turn up when they were said they were going to. But in most kinds of MMC, that will have a much greater effect on your project plan and your costings than it will potentially on a traditional build, because so many things hinge on those particular timings, and a couple of days lost to a certain trade will actually have a huge knock-on impact of that overall program. And I think that's the case for many forms of MMC. In the form of modular, you've obviously got lots and lots of other questions that the question of timing brings up. So if there is a problem in the transport and those units cannot be delivered on site that day, what happens to them? Where do they go? Has the factory got the ability to store any units for you if there's a problem with timings? If your services aren't connected on site in time, what happens? Do you still want the units delivered? Do you want them kept by the factory? Are you going to have them on site, but then have to do some sort of relifting? And I've seen this happen, units having to be relifted off their foundations to have service works done to them because they weren't done on time and the factory had no storage. So it's all that kind of thing as well that needs to be worked through, obviously, in the contracts, as Neil was talking, but it's just going into that with your eyes wide open. There's lots and lots of other things that you just would never have to think of on a traditional build. Also think about timings in terms of grant. You know, if you're a strategic partner, you've got a little bit more flexibility, but if you're bidding for this through CME, you will have quite strict timings in terms of grant. You need to be really open with whoever your MMC provider is, that those are your timings, because if you're looking at a slot in a factory and that doesn't work with your Homes England timings, you need to know that from day one, not kind of just as you're waiting for the delivery to come on site. I think my unpopular opinion on MMC is don't trust everything that the sales team tell you. So my experience of MMC is that you will get a very different response from different members of that MMC team that you speak to. And my word of advice is get under the skin of it and be a pain in the bum. Get your asset teams along, get your property services teams along, because they're the ones, as development, we do not have that expertise, generally speaking. They are the ones who will ask the difficult questions of those MMC providers about long-term sustainability, about adaptations, about what happens when X, Y, and Z need servicing, what happens when X, Y, and Z breaks down, what happens in 60 years' time, what is your lifespan on these components, what do I need to consider when I'm looking at replacement of components, etc. So get them on board as early as you can and just be a pain. And that will help you in terms of what Neil and David were saying about dealing with reputable firms. That'll almost help you wheedle out the not so great ones, the ones who haven't got that sort of history behind them, who haven't got that backup. Ask them where they've done it. Ask to see a finished product. That's your first alarm bell, isn't it? Well, we haven't actually got one yet. We're still in the prototype phase, etc. And I know that, you know, we want to support small and medium enterprises, but my personal experience again is that actually during Innovation Village, for example, 3 of the companies who were originally involved went bust just during that kind of 2-year phase. So you absolutely have to be aware of that. And they were the companies who couldn't answer the questions about component replacements. They were the companies who couldn't ask us about long-term warranties. And yeah, coming on to warranties, I suppose. So building warranties, big one as well, isn't it? Who's a building warranty with? You know, it's great to say, yeah, we're accredited, but what is in that building warranty? Because again, it is not, it's as Neil said, it's the same, but it's not quite the same. So you've got to be really clear on what those nuances are that make it different from a traditional NHBC warranty, you know, whatever kind, LABC warranty, whatever kind you've got. And be really clear again with your asset maintenance teams on what that looks like and what the process looks like, what you're liable for and what you wouldn't be liable for. The big thing for me is understand the design limitations of who you're working with as well, and make sure that your board, your exec team are really aware that with many MMC modular products, it is a product that is made in a factory and you cannot change many items in that product. So you may want it to look a certain way. You may have a set of standard house types that you want them to emulate. In many cases, that is just not possible. And you might get quite far along the line before someone actually admits that to you in the MMC factory or in the MMC team. But be really clear about that from day one. You know, this is what is your product? This is our product. This is your product. Is there a middle meeting or is there not? And as Neil said, there's a lot about intellectual property rights. There's a lot that the MMC providers will just say that is actually not open to negotiation because that's how the process works. You know, the sizes for transportation, etc., all that kind of stuff. I think the other really practical thing that I would say, having experienced it, is walk the final route into your development. If you are looking at modular, walk it at all times of the day, because although the company might be responsible for it in the contract, ultimately you do not want your beautiful new modular unit turning up and it can't get down the road because every Thursday somebody parks their Arctic there because that's when they come home from their particular shift. And again, I have seen that. So a route that looks perfectly sensible, perfectly workable, actually at certain times of the day, cars parked either side, particular types of vehicles parked either side, which have caused a massive headache. People soon moved once they saw what was coming. We had lots of people running out of their houses to immediately move their cars from the side of the road when they saw what was coming down the road. But that was in an area where we'd done quite a lot of community involvement and consultation, given what it was. You might not get that in other particular areas. So just be really aware of that route and walk it yourself, understand your site, see what's around you, understand what your neighbours are like, because it's kind of the last puzzle piece, if you like, that can scup you at the final term. And then I guess the other bit for me that obviously these guys haven't touched on, but from an RP point of view, is I would say aftercare and customers. So, it isn't a standard build product. If you're putting somebody in a modular home, there are things that they will need to kind of adapt to in terms of the way that they live, that the asset and the property services team will have to work through with customers. For me, it's no different from when we're building net carbon zero homes. There's certain things in those homes that customers have to just adapt to differently. And I think it's the same with some, with some items, depending on what type of MMC. Obviously, there's different levels of restrictions, etc. But it's just about being open with those customers from day one. I think we're all really, we all want to say that MMC and modular is just like traditional. It's great, go and look at it. It looks just as good. It's, you can build it just as brilliantly, all that kind of stuff. But the truth is, it is different. And I don't think we should shy away from that in terms of all of the advantages are great, but it is slightly different, and customers do need to be aware of that when they're moving into those properties, as do asset and and property services teams as well. So I think we shouldn't shy away from saying MMC is a bit different, but it's still, it's great and it's different for all these really good reasons.
Thank you, Joy. Wow, that was brilliant. Thank you. That was absolutely fantastic. Before we move on to questions and answers, I can see this one already in the chat. I'm going to ask everyone here to, in the chat, tell me if you would go forward on an MMC scheme. If you would, why? What would be the driver? Why would you take on the risk? If you wouldn't, why not? So if you could all do that, that would be extremely helpful. And we'll try and get an idea for how many people watching this is actually planning and would do it. So that would be extremely valuable. And any questions and answers, please put them in the Q&A box, and then other people can upvote them. And yes, that's right. They can all be upvoted and commented on. So let's start with the first question. John Prickett, anything to add regarding the tiny homes or other small house model? And he's asking from a community-led housing viewpoint. David or Neil? Neil?
I can. So I do quite a lot of work with a company called Pocket Living, who are London-based and use modular, not exclusively, but quite a lot, and are very happy with it. And I think they would never describe their units as tiny, but they are small, and they acknowledge that they're small, and they have dealt with that by really looking at the design of their units. When you walk into one of their units, the exact placing of the doors, the exact placing of the shower, it all really works really well. And that's because they've invested the time on the design, knowing that they were using a smaller footprint than many people would be used to. The other things that they have done in their buildings is really accentuate the common parts. So they will quite often have communal roof gardens, they'll have communal laundry rooms, they'll have lots of communal areas, so lots of people can spend lots of time outside their flats. And then the final thing they've done is they really work hard to build a community, so people use those areas. They don't build a development and leave it. They positively encourage their tenants to get to know each other. They kind of have wine and cheese evenings when the people move in. They really try and make sure that people use the common parts, which makes their flats seem less small. But I think it's mainly design. It can work really well as long as it's very well designed.
Thank you, Neil. David?
Yeah. As you say, people like Pocket Living, they do embrace off-site like steel framing. And I think the issue for me is if you were talking, let's say, a tiny house, i.e. a single unit that is a small house, you have not a lot of structure for still quite a high level of technical input, getting into that design and making sure everything works. So for me, I've got no issues with, you know, the size of each unit, but I prefer to see quite a few units together. So the pocket living model, where you have a, let's say, I don't know, 4, 5, 6-story apartment block that is very small units within, but the design is there, the traceability is there, the efficiency is there, then yeah, great, it works. There's no issues with that whatsoever. It's just understanding what works with light gauge steel frame, the efficiencies that are needed, the traceability to give. Yeah, our aim is not to sell steel, it's to sell a solution. So if we can do it with less steel in a more efficient way, then all to the good, really, for everybody concerned. So yeah, I don't have any issues with that whatsoever.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So we're going to go to, I can see the questions, the comments are coming in on the chat. This is all extremely useful stuff. So if you haven't commented, please do let us know your intentions with MMC. I'm now going to go to Nick Hotskin. What's your experience of RPs using MMC to construct on existing assets, rooftops? Do you envisage this as a significant growth area to eliminate the land cost? So I believe that would be for you, David.
Yeah, we do get quite a few inquiries in about rooftop extensions, and they're usually 1 or 2 stories on top of an existing. And the issues, as far as I'm concerned, is what is it that's supporting that? You know, have you got, you know, we'll produce a line and point load for the structure that we're going to provide, and obviously whatever we sit on needs to be able to support that. So, you know, that's down to the client to get that structurally assessed. It may well be that there is a grillage needed to support our frame. And again, you then have the issues with fire protection between the two. So these are all things that are easily overcome. However, it has to be considered when you're doing this. It's not just a simple case of dropping something on top of an existing building. There's a lot of work that needs to be done beforehand. But yes, we do get quite a few inquiries with that. And for me, they're generally 1 or 2 stories and something that we're quite happy to look at.
And I would say 2 issues from the kind of legal side. One is resident consultation and involvement is an absolute must. People are very concerned at having things put on top of their buildings, and you need to, you know, it's a journey to explain to them that this isn't going to adversely affect them. So there's that, and you also need, if you've got leaseholders in blocks, to work out what rights you've already granted and whether or not you're going to be interfering with those rights, and how easy it is to move those rights and deal with people who have rights that might otherwise interfere with development. But I mean, it is a great way of intensifying use and you know, using land that doesn't really exist because it's already got a building on it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Neil. I've got some comments coming in thick and fast. Thank you for everyone who is giving us your input on this. More is welcome. So this is a question to David. Have Fusion been involved in any schemes for a registered provider of social housing?
Yes, indeed we have. We have many different clients. We'll generally engage with the main contractor, but that main contractor could well be working for a developer, an RP, an investor. It varies. You know, for me, it's not the end client that is the issue here. It's the design of the scheme and how early that they engage in embracing that design to suit light gauge steel framing and to get all of the benefits that we can offer on that. So yeah, you know, we're happy to talk to any RPs for social housing and any potential clients out there.
Okay, thank you, David. So here's from Keith. Question to Neil. We have been approached by a modular developer who are seeking to secure a site, then enter into a back-to-back land and build contract. If the value triggers the UK Public Contracts Reg's mark of 4.7 million, how can contracts be structured to remain compliant?
Well, usually, as long as they have secured the site and they are bringing you the site and the build, that will be okay. That's relatively easy to structure a contract so that they are connected, and therefore there's an exemption from the procurement rules where they're effectively bringing the land with them. So usually that should be okay. You need to be alive to it, but it's not usually a problem as long as they are the ones securing the site. It would be more difficult if you owned the land and someone came along and said, we can build, as the previous example, on the top of your buildings, because you already have the land and therefore they're not bringing something that other people couldn't bring. But if they're bringing the land to the table, then that should be okay for procurement rules.
Thank you very much. Any comments on that, David?
Bear with me. I was having a scan through the other things.
That back-to-back land and build contracts, is that the sort of thing you've done?
It's not the sort of thing that I would typically get involved with, and I would definitely bow to Neil's experience on that and leave the answer with Neil, I'm afraid.
Okay, excellent. We've got another question here. Can MMC reduce demand on local business and jobs if properties are constructed off-site? This could make it politically more difficult to sell MMC.
I'd like to answer that one.
Please.
For me, if you're going down a completely volumetric modular route where everything is done off-site in a factory that's away from the local area, then yes, I can see that. I can see that the issues are going to be there, but there's still going to be an element of works for preparation of the site, for enabling works and bringing in of services and everything else, and also the finishing off and the landscaping. So there's certainly going to be a lot of work there. In terms of light gauge steel framing, although we are doing the structural solution off-site, there are still quite a lot of trades that are involved with what we do. So, you know, although we're putting up the superstructure, they have to wrap it. So you are going to get your internal dry liners, your M&E specialists, your external facades, your window companies, you know, whatever finishes on the roof and the insulation. There's going to be quite a few trades in there. However, you're still ticking that off-site MMC box. But to engage and sort of, you know, some light gauge steel frame companies, I'm not going to say whether it was us or not, potentially we've done this where we'll look at bringing in apprentices and offering local people local work to try and sort of engage with the local community to get them on board. But I understand what they're saying there, and all I would say is that with panelized off-site light gauge steel frame, the benefits you're going to get, you're still going to get quite a lot of trades coming in, quite a lot of work, and the ability for local people to be involved and to appease that objection, if you like.
And it's actually quite an interesting question. You also need to think about what the planning requirements are. Lots of planning agreements will require you to have a percentage of local labour. Yes. And so you need to make sure you've thought that through with your contractor and your constructor to make sure that you can still comply. And as David says, there is still plenty to do on site, so you probably will be able to, but it's not as easy as in a traditional build, so you just need to be careful.
Excellent, thank you very much. Thank you, Neil. So we've got another question coming here. Now, we've already answered half of this question. Have Fusion been involved in any schemes for a registered provider of social housing? The answer was yes. But now the second one, the second part, how important do the panel think MMC will be for RPs going forward in terms of percentage compared to traditional builds?
I'm not going to give a percentage, but I do have a degree of faith that in 10 years' time it will be a significant part of the delivery. I think the benefits vastly outweigh the disadvantages. I think there has been other countries have adopted it and are very happy with it. I think there's been a reticence in Britain, partly because of our effective use of it in the post-war for emergency housing, which then has lasted much longer than it was ever expected to last or designed to last, which means that a lot of it is not looking great now because it wasn't designed to be there now. But I think it's kind of reaching a critical mass where actually people can see MMC buildings in their neighborhoods and think, actually, that looks really nice. And the other benefits are so huge compared to, as I say, the disbenefits. I think we're reaching that critical mass where people say, actually, that's a great way of building.
Neil, I was in a modular house in CIH They were all standing outside. You walk around, you can feel the floor wobble. People don't trust that. They don't trust a structure that isn't strong. They don't like things that wobble. They don't like things that don't look like brick and stone. Is that also part of it?
It is, but that's not, I mean, that is not my experience of developments where it's modular. I mean, I've been around plenty of clients, modular developments, and in a sense, I would say it was the opposite, which is compared to modern traditional build, which is often criticised for the walls being very thin and sound insulation not being as good as it might be. Certainly the modular ones that I have walked around have felt extremely solid and extremely, secure, warm and well built. And I would say better than traditional build in many cases. So I worry then that the modular units that got the CIH is not a good advertisement, but that's not my experience of actual buildings in the real world.
Well, they paid a lot of money for that advertisement.
Yeah.
David, how would you say your structures? Did they feel strong? Did they feel solid? Do you think people would get a lot of security from seeing them and viewing them?
But without a shadow of doubt, if I'm going to engage with a new client and they've no real experience, the first thing I'll try and do is take them to a live site so they can actually see what goes on, how it feels as you walk around, and whether or not you're talking a concrete floor or a steel cassette floor. They are very robust, and I've never had anybody have any issues with that. I had one client who actually said, "Oh, I thought it would start swaying. I thought it would start moving, but this is incredibly robust." And it was like, yes, and I don't really know why you were thinking about that. But in terms of the percentage that you run about there, like I was saying, the narrative has changed dramatically over the last few years, where it's not a case of trying to change the perceptions and trying to get them to embrace change and do it differently. They're now thinking that this is their first port of call. Yeah, how can we do it in offsite MMC? What is the right solution for that? So I think that percentage, I don't have the stats or the figures, but I think that will grow, and people will move more and more away from traditional build because of the labour issues, the labour shortage, and I suppose the materials issues. You're getting a lot more peace of mind, I suppose, by doing it off-site, because you know what you're going to get. You can go and have a look at the manufacturing facility. You can see all the materials there, and you understand what you're going to get when you're going to get it. Program certainty and cost certainty is a key driver in this market.
Thank you, David. I've got a question here. I'm going to go to Mark Rodwell's question. I was hoping to bring up myself. It's a very valuable one we haven't covered yet. Do the panel have any thoughts on how the build costs compare per square meter against a traditional build? Now, that's excluding high-rise development. Lots of RPs will still view the costs as one of the most critical deciding factors. David?
I knew you were going to go to me first. Yeah, thank you for that. It's not just about how the costs compare. You have to look at one of the big things. When I mentioned draw your line in the sand and decide how you're going to build this. One of the big mistakes that clients make is that they will start to design the foundations and all the enabling works for a heavier weight structure. And if they then decide that they're going to go down a lighter weight structure, they won't bother to change what they've already designed for. Oh, it'll support it, it will be fine. When realistically, if you design for a lighter structure early on, and the support for that in the ground is designed because of the fact that you're using offsite MMC, which is a lot lighter, a lot faster, you're going to get some quite significant savings. I mean, my own personal thoughts, and other people may say it's different. I think 25% savings in the ground, without a shadow of a doubt, against a heavier weight structure. But again, you've also got a faster build. You've got an early return on investment. You've got there are less costs associated by doing it quicker. And if you just look at, well, I can build a house for that much, but if I do it in offsite MMC, it's going to cost me a little bit more. However, you're going to get it quicker. You're going to get people in and paying money for it, whether it's a build to rent scheme or a sales scheme. You're going to get an early return on investment. And that is something that has to be taken into account.
Thank you, David. Neil, anything to add to that?
Not only that. I mean, people aren't romantic about it. People are doing it as a hard-nosed business decision. And as David said, but you need to look at that in the round. It's not just the build cost; it's how quick it's delivered, when you can get your rent in, how long you hold the asset before it's working for you. But on that basis, people are looking at, I say, they're not doing it out of a intention to be novel. They are doing it because it works for them.
Joy.
Yeah, so I think it's going to start changing as well. So for me, we are now as RPs considering, so forget the sale product, I'm talking about an asset that we hold. We're just about to move into the future home standard. We're all now talking about net carbon zero. We're all talking about SAPC before, 2028, but really 2038, but really net carbon zero is where we're all, we've got our eye on the prize now. Resource directors are all wringing their hands looking at how much money it's going to cost us. And for me, I think that gap is going to start decreasing when you start considering what we're going to have to build into our traditional build homes to get them to net carbon zero ready, or, even just below net carbon zero ready, where we say, actually, we know we're going to have to come back and retrofit, but we're only going to have to retrofit, £10,000 worth of work instead of £40,000 worth of work. So I'm really aware to the fact that MMC at the moment, many of the types of MMC is more expensive. And so for me as a rural housing provider, it is really difficult to make MMC work on my small rural sites. But moving forwards and looking at how much it's going to cost for me to be able to get our small and medium contractors, even our small, larger contractors, the way the supply chain is at the moment, the knowledge that they're going to need, etc., to be getting them to the point where we can get those kind of net carbon zero ready homes across all of our development program. That is such a big ask, and that is going to have such a cost premium with it, that for me, that's when we're going to start seeing those gaps really starting to shrink. And that is why I think, in response to the earlier question, we will start to see MMC taking up a much bigger proportion of programs, as RPs who perhaps in the past been able to kind of just blame cost as a reason for not doing it. They're going to start seeing that disappear, because the standards that we're going to have to build to can really be accommodated a lot through what David's been talking about, and a lot of the modular stuff as well. That's inbuilt into that process already, in a way that it's just not in traditional build at the moment.
Thank you, Joy. We're going to have 2 questions left, and then we're going to have to wrap up at 11. But before that, we're going to stay on, Joy. This is a question directly for you. Has your experience with MMC given you more confidence that this is the future route for RPs? And what was, if any, your major learning from the MMC scheme? Now, I suppose you've covered some of that, Joy, but if I could press you to one major outcome.
So the major outcome for me was the front end work, was that design work. So for me, it's that difference between what they say it's going to do and what it's actually going to do, and that level of detail and questioning that you just must get into at the front end. I think on the whole project, we could have saved probably 8 months if that had been done at the front end, because we lost supplies as a result of that. There was quite a lot of, David talks about the fact that you were then trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, because that work just hadn't, we were all thinking we were on the same page, and actually halfway through realised that suddenly that page had been rewritten. And that's my, really go into it with your eyes wide open and just challenge every, potentially we were told, yes, we can do that. That's no problem. 3-story, no problem. Yeah, we've got a bungalow, we can do that with, etc., etc. And the reality was that was just not achievable with a particular type of modular that we were looking to use. But it took a really long time to find that out, and it was just a waste of everybody's time, quite frankly. So that was my biggest learning. Did that say to me that it was the future? Yeah, because obviously for me, working on Innovation Village specifically, we used so many different types, and I think that was the really big piece of learning for me, was let's not all get stuck on modular, which is great to have David here, but let's not all get stuck on that kind of MMC offsite. There are lots and lots of solutions in MMC. And so, for example, now, as I said, me looking at a rural perspective, then in many cases, there is not a chance I am getting a modular unit down one of my little country lanes in Hawes across a stream. But actually, that doesn't mean that I have to close the door on MMC. What it means is I just know that that particular product isn't right. But actually, maybe steel frame would be, maybe SIPS process would be, there's lots and lots of other things that we can look at. So yes, I do think it's a future, but not necessarily modular as just the future.
Excellent. Thank you, Joy. And I think that takes us on nicely to what's going to be the last question from John Prickett. Is the advantage sometimes mentioned of movability of small MMC homes a bit of a myth, especially as it naturally excludes foundations and services? David?
Well, if he's on about moving a volumetric modular home, then yes, it's possible. You've got a, let's just say it's a 2 up, 2 down. You've got 4 modules to make a house. Typically, yeah, you could pick it up and you could move it and you could relocate it, and you'd leave whatever foundations were there to support the building, that you leave, and you could do it. The question is, would you want to do it?
Neil?
That would be my question. Why? It doesn't. The number of situations where you want to build to that level and then move it, I think, is probably pretty niche.
Okay,
Yeah.
it does get talked about, John says, quite a bit, and he agrees why. I mean, I know in tiny homes, people who are allowed to build them, and that's a big movement that's actually happening all over New Zealand, Australia, and America, but not here because of the several laws, including caravans. They're building tiny houses directly on modified caravan frames, and those can be moved quite easily. And you can actually build some pretty incredible stuff on that. But yeah, okay. Right, so I think I'm going to wrap up now. It's 11 o'clock. I want to thank everyone today. So thank you so much, Neil Toner, David Ellison, Joy Winnerah. We've had a great conversation. Thanks for everyone who's been coming and been involved in this and sent us your questions, comments, and feedback. So I think we've made some huge progress today for everyone. Our next webinar is probably going to be early December. We're going to be talking about the niches of viability in local authority specific development. It's its own thing. There's a lot more local authorities developing, and we want to cover what is viability today in 2022 onwards. What is it going to cover? What's important? What isn't? So that's, look out for that. We're just trying to get speakers at the moment for that. So if you're working for a local authority and want to discuss viability, then please do join us or get in touch. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your. Oh, sorry, David. David's got his hand up. Did you have
I didn't realise that had happened. That must have caught it. No, I was just going to say there was quite a few things in the chat where they were asking about whether or not this would work or that would work. If anybody wishes to get in touch with me, please get in touch with me. We'll look at the scheme and we'll advise you as best we can. But there you go. That's my bit done. Thank you.
Absolutely, and also the presentations will be sent to Neil Toner as well. We're going to, as many people as they possibly want to, we will send you to Neil or David. If you want to get in touch with any of them, just let us know. Okay, well, everyone, have a really great week, and thank you very much for tuning in today.
Cheers, thank you.
Thanks.
Bye now.